And it was with the cover of this chaos that a Brazilian man by the name of Rafiel Torre would find his way into the burgeoning mixed martial arts scene. Boasting a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, an illustrious Navy SEAL career, and an undefeated 14-0 MMA record, Torre swiftly embedded himself within the MMA community as both an expert and an enthusiast. But the more Rafiel shared about his life, the more his story began to unravel, and he would leave the MMA scene in a cloud of controversy, with accusations his career in the Navy SEALs was a fabrication, his jiu-jitsu skills were a sham, and his undefeated 14-0 MMA record simply did not exist. In fact, there were even doubts about his real name and nationality. As if his fraudulent exploits weren't enough, Torre would later become entangled in a shocking murder case, accused of attempting to pay a UFC fighter to do a hit for him. This video tells the wild and almost unbelievable story of Rafiel Torre, MMA's most deadly fraudster. But before we get into discussing today's fraudster, I want to talk about avoiding fraudsters with the help of today's video sponsor, Aura. These days, the odds of our data falling into the hands of scammers and criminals is higher than ever, thanks to a constant stream of data breaches at companies we entrusted to properly secure our personal information. For example, a staggering 2.9 billion records were compromised in the National Public Data Breach, with the compromised info including full names, addresses, phone numbers, and even social security numbers. Personally, my own data has been exposed in breaches at StockX and Adobe. Not even someone as elusive as Anderson Silva can dodge these attacks. But that's where Aura comes in. Aura offers a comprehensive suite of tools to keep you safe from scammers and fraudsters. Its identity theft protection scans billions of data points to alert you immediately if your personal information has been compromised. If someone tries to open a credit card or loan in your name, Aura's financial fraud alerts notify you within minutes, so you can act fast and stop the thief in their tracks. Aura also includes a VPN, an antivirus, a password manager, and even a data broker opt-out service. Plus, their 24/7 US-based support means you'll always have someone to turn to when fighting against online fraudsters. Aura packages all of these services in one app at one affordable price. I'm not leaving myself and my family vulnerable to data breaches and brokers, and if you don't want to either, you can go to aura.com/Narera to try 2 weeks of Aura for free. That will be enough time for Aura to find out if any of your personal data is currently exposed. Thanks again to Aura for sponsoring and supporting the channel. Let's get into the video. With the poor state of the sport in the late 1990s, the barrier to entry for MMA journalism, especially at the regional level, was non-existent, with very few people daft enough to commit themselves to traveling up and down the country to cover a sport people weren't too interested in reading about. But one man would enter the MMA journalism scene and began to separate himself from the journalistic pack, covering any and every MMA event he could find along the west coast of the US. His name was Rafiel Torre, and his stated mission was to do his part to grow the sport he loved by giving it the coverage that it deserved. Rafiel's love of MMA was instilled in him by his Brazilian father, who was himself a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and had personally groomed and trained his son into following in his footsteps, with Rafiel himself eventually earning a black belt of his own. Rafiel's status as a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt gave him immediate credibility in the MMA scene, with his credentials showing he was just like the fighters that he was now covering. But Rafiel Torre was more than just a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. He had also had a distinguished career in the prestigious Navy SEALs, serving his country and further proving his toughness and mental fortitude. But the cherry on top, not only was Rafiel Torre a complete badass, but he'd also stepped into the cage and proved it, boasting a 14-0 undefeated record in mixed martial arts. Unfortunately, as he would tell those listening, due to the primitive nature of MMA at the time, all of his 14 fights had not been documented, and they took place in small venues and gyms with nobody to vouch for their existence, forever lost to the sands of time. A tragedy, but nobody doubted the prowess of a man so committed to martial arts. Torre applied the same work ethic that had allowed him to flourish at BJJ and in the Navy SEALs to his journalism, prolifically attending events and releasing blogs and exclusive interviews secured with the top fighters of his era, such as Ken Shamrock and Tito Ortiz. The fighters themselves enjoyed their interviews with Torre because he was one of them, and he understood the sacrifices that needed to be made to compete in MMA. Torre also struck up friendships with the likes of Joe Rogan and Eddie Bravo, embedding himself in the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu community thanks to his charismatic personality and high energy, which was aided by an addiction to speed. And when Rafiel Torre wasn't getting attention and building his reputation at events, he was at home talking up himself on the various MMA forums of the time, furthering his notoriety as a man who had done it all. But eventually, Torre's incessant bragging and self-promotion would land him trouble when he ran into a certain Sheikh Tahnoon bin Zayed Al Nahyan at one of the events he was covering. Sheikh Tahnoon, a prominent member of the United Arab Emirates royal family, was the biggest martial arts promoter in the Middle East and had developed a love for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu while studying in the US. This love of the sport would compel him to use a small portion of his vast wealth to create the ADCC Submission Fighting World Championship, the world's premier grappling tournament of the time. When Sheikh Tahnoon was introduced to Torre and began to hear about his amazing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu skills and undefeated MMA record, the Sheikh wanted to see it for himself, and he did not hesitate in offering Torre a spot to compete on the next ADCC Submission Fighting World Championship. Put on the spot, this was an offer that Torre couldn't have refused without looking silly, and he agreed to compete at the event, marking the first time that his friends in the martial arts community would get to witness his top-level skills on display. The only issue was, his top-level skills did not exist. Rafiel Torre was a complete and total fraud, with no Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu skills to speak of. He had not been training since he was a kid, his dad was not a black belt with nobody having ever heard of him, even though this alleged black belt would have been earned during a time where there were barely any black belts in existence. And in fact, Torre had even lied about his dad being Brazilian, and he had no Brazilian blood in him. His entire BJJ journey was a complete fantasy that was about to be exposed at ADCC. I'm almost surprised he went through with competing at ADCC, given he must have known what was to come. But perhaps he was deluded enough to think that he could just figure out how to tap out a black belt on short notice. Sheikh Tahnoon organized a grappling match with Bo Hirschberger, a legitimate black belt under Rickson Gracie. On paper, it was a showdown of equals. In reality, it was anything but. Hirschberger dispatched Torre in under a minute, exposing Torre's complete lack of grappling skill to the astonishment of onlookers who had endured Torre's relentless self-promotion. Fortunately for Torre, this humiliation wasn't captured on film, a small mercy in the pre-social media era. But there was no denying that those who attended ADCC would never view Torre the same way again, and the same fate would await Torre when he foolishly accepted an invitation to roll with Eddie Bravo on the mats at Eddie's gym. Again, I have to question why on earth he would accept this invitation given he knew he wasn't a black belt. But Torre traveled to his friend Eddie Bravo's gym, intent on trying to prove his imaginary credentials against a true expert in the sport. Predictably, this went horribly, as Joe Rogan would recall on his podcast.
He was telling everybody he was a black belt, and Eddie rolled with him. And I remember him coming back to me, and he's like, "That guy's not a black belt." And I go, "What, you sure?" And he goes, "Dude, he don't know anything. Like, it was too crazy. It was like it was like a white belt."
Initially, Eddie Bravo thought Torre's poor performance on the mat might have been due to nerves or him going super easy for whatever reason. But as Bravo reflected on the encounter and discussed it with others in the BJJ community, the truth became glaringly obvious. Torre was a complete and utter fraud who had been lying to his face for years. Incensed, Eddie would call Torre and demand to know if he was actually a black belt. Realizing he'd been caught out, Torre would panic and claim his black belt was actually in Japanese Jiu-Jitsu rather than Brazilian, an excuse that Eddie Bravo did not buy at all, branding Torre a liar and cutting him off from his life completely. Between the ADCC fiasco and now being exposed by influential members of the West Coast martial arts scene, Rafiel Torre's reputation had been severely dented, and he would make a retreat from the fighting scene for almost a year. But he couldn't face walking away forever from the connections he'd made and the persona that he'd built. And so, in a desperate attempt to regain credibility, the alleged 14-0 Rafiel Torre would come out of MMA retirement for one last fight. But it wouldn't just be any fight to drag such a legend out of retirement. This was a grudge match. Torre allegedly had simmering beef with his opponent Ioka Tianu, a heavyweight who claimed to be a former student of Rafiel before they'd fallen out and started feuding. The fight unfolded at King of the Cage's notorious Wet n Wild card, which was held outdoors in a torrential downpour that completely soaked the cage. Yet even a literal monsoon wasn't enough to wash away the stink of what Torre was about to serve up. The bout was promoted as his 15th career fight, despite no evidence of the previous 14, setting the stage for a bizarre spectacle. Now this might shock you, so sit down and brace yourself, but this bout was not actually a real fight. Rafiel Torre had made up the backstory of the feud, paid off his opponent, and won via submission in less than 2 minutes by a knee bar after his opponent graciously gave him his leg and tapped out before his knee was even fully extended. Far from redeeming himself, Torre's staged victory only furthered his reputation as a con artist. The sham fight destroyed any remaining credibility he had and left him ostracized in the MMA community, branded a compulsive liar for the years of deceit. Torre would once again disappear from the MMA scene in the aftermath of this embarrassing fight, and in his absence, the depths of his fakery would emerge even further. Given the obvious lies around his MMA record and black belt, it was clear Torre was also lying about his decorated career in the Navy SEALs. But it seemed Rafiel Torre had a severe compulsion for making stuff up, with one story emerging from a former friend of Torre who claimed Torre had asked him for a ride to a forest nearby, claiming he was going to compete in an underground fighting championship. He asked the friend to pick him up in 2 days from the same spot outside the forest. And when his friend returned after 2 days, Torre was waiting for him with a trophy that he had allegedly won at this totally real underground fight card held in the woods. Another deception was exposed when it was revealed that Rafiel Torre had even made up his name and he was actually called Ralph Bartel. But the circumstances of this lie being exposed were completely wild, with Rafiel's name being revealed only because he had been arrested on charges of murder. Since stepping away from the MMA scene, Rafiel Torre had started a relationship with a woman by the name of Angelina Richards. There was just one issue with Angelina: she was married. Rather than divorce her husband and start a new life with her new lover, Rafiel and Angelina hatched a depraved plan to secure the finances for their new life together, and unfortunately, it involved murdering her husband. She convinced her husband to take out a life insurance policy while she plotted behind his back with Torre about how they would get him out of the picture and get the money. Luckily, thanks to his connections, or what remained of them, in the MMA scene, Rafiel Torre felt he knew just the man with the skills and desperation to get the job done. He would contact Gerald Strabent, a former UFC fighter, and offered him $10,000 for carrying out the hit on the husband. But unfortunately for Torre, Gerald would decline to be involved, leaving him out of options. Unable to find a hitman willing to help, Torre took matters into his own hands, literally. He lured the unsuspecting husband to a gym he co-owned, and then ambushed and killed him with a rear naked choke in a chilling, premeditated attack that revealed just how much of a lowlife he really was. Of course, there's some irony in the fact that a fake Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu master committed murder with a rear naked choke, but unfortunately, this is a tragic incident. In the aftermath, Rafiel would call Gerald Strabent and claim he'd killed the husband, but it was in self-defense after his affair with the man's wife had been rumbled. He asked Gerald to provide him with a made-up alibi to try and avoid going down for the crime, but Gerald refused to help Rafiel, and he was on his own. It might have seemed like Rafiel was completely screwed now, but remarkably, more than a year passed after the murder with no arrest. A confident and well-practiced liar, Rafiel's self-defense argument seemed to be winning out, with no evidence to contradict the notion of an enraged husband coming at Rafiel with a gun and forcing his hand. Unfortunately for Rafiel though, his failed attempt at hiring a hitman was about to come back and bite him, as Gerald Strabent, fearing Rafiel was getting away with the crime, decided enough was enough, and he went to the police to divulge the bounty that he had been offered to carry out the murder. Arrested and charged with murder, Torre clung to his self-defense claim, portraying himself as the victim of an enraged husband armed with a gun. But his lies unraveled under scrutiny yet again. The jury completely saw through his fabrications and convicted him of premeditated murder. Rafiel Torre, or Ralph Bartel, was given a sentence of life without parole, marking a grim end to the saga of a man who had lived a life consumed by delusion and lies. On a bit of a side tangent, it appears that Rafiel Torre's belief that Gerald Strabent was capable of killing wasn't actually too far off base, as a decade after Rafiel was jailed, Strabent was involved in a road rage incident that resulted in a 53-year-old man being shot dead, though Strabent was found guilty of criminally negligent homicide and served less than 3 years behind bars. Rafiel Torre, on the other hand, is still behind bars in a California prison where he has been for the last 20 years, and he will remain behind bars for the rest of his life, no doubt subjecting the rest of the inmates to his countless stories of made-up nonsense as he slowly withers away. The end. Thanks for watching the video. Please drop a like if you enjoyed, and check out my video on Khalil Rountree's journey from super morbidly obese teenager to elite MMA fighter. Subscribe to the channel if you want more videos just like this one, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.